6 interruptions. 6 sharp cuts through her words, each one like a blade meant to slice her argument into pieces before it could even be heard. The room wasn't just watching a debate anymore, it was watching an attempted silencing. Ted Cruz leaned forward, his voice laced with the same smugness that has followed him through countless hearings. He smirked as though the room belonged to him, as though authority meant the right to drown out anyone who dared to speak with conviction. And on the other side of that table sat Jasmine Crockett. Her hands rested firmly on the desk, her eyes locked forward, steady and unflinching. Each time he cut in, she paused, held her composure, and waited. The interruptions piled up like storm clouds gathering in the distance, each one heavier, darker, more charged than the last. The committee room grew tense. Staffers shifted uncomfortably. Viewers online typed furiously, fingers slamming keyboards in disbelief. 6 times he tried to derail her. 6 times he underestimated the strength sitting across from him. But then came the 7th. With a tone dripping in condescension, Cruz leaned back in his chair and unleashed one more interruption, a line so brazen that it cut through the air like a slap. It wasn't just disrespect, it was dismissal. A man who has built a career on loudness and bluster was now weaponizing those very tactics against a congresswoman who had earned her voice through resilience, grit, and unshakable resolve. For a moment, silence filled the chamber. Even the usual shuffle of papers seemed to stop. The weight of Cruz's words lingered in the air, daring anyone to challenge them. Cameras zoomed closer, capturing the faint curl of his lips, the arrogance etched into his posture. He believed he had scored his moment, that he had seized control. But he had miscalculated, because what Cruz did not see, what he could not anticipate, was that Jasmine Crockett was not merely waiting for her turn. She was preparing for it, and as the echo of his 7th interruption hung in the room, the stage was set for a response that would flip the entire exchange on its head. But what happened after those words left the room in stunned silence changed everything. The setting was not just any committee hearing. It was one of those rare arenas where the stakes extend far beyond the 4 walls of Congress, where every question, every gesture, every word spoken is immediately broadcast, dissected, and magnified across the nation. These hearings are more than policy discussions. They are battlegrounds of narrative, stages where reputations are forged or shattered in the court of public opinion. On one side sat Ted Cruz, the senator from Texas with a long history of commanding microphones and overwhelming opponents with sheer volume. His reputation precedes him, a man who often substitutes dominance for dialogue, interruptions for arguments. For years, critics have accused him of wielding arrogance like a weapon, cutting into conversations not to clarify but to control. To his supporters, this makes him a fighter. To his detractors, it makes him the embodiment of everything that suffocates honest debate. And yet across from him sat someone who could not be bullied into silence. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett. Known for her fiery clarity and razor-sharp precision, she has become one of the few figures who can match Cruz's interruptions, not with louder bluster, but with sharper truth. Crockett's rise was not fueled by theatrics, but by substance, resilience, and a willingness to speak plainly about issues many try to complicate. To those who feel unheard, she has become a voice. To those who traffic in arrogance, she is a problem. This wasn't just Cruz versus Crockett. It was the clash of 2 legacies, one built on entitlement, the other on endurance. One rooted in the power of privilege, the other in the power of perseverance. Their collision in this committee room symbolized something much larger than one argument. It mirrored the struggle of millions across the country who see themselves constantly interrupted, dismissed or spoken over, at work, in classrooms, in their communities. Every camera in that chamber was trained on the exchange, and every network knew exactly what was unfolding. A showdown. For Cruz, another interruption was just part of his performance, another tactic to assert control. For Crockett, every interruption was a reminder of why her presence there mattered, because if she could not demand respect inside the halls of power, what hope was there for those outside it? As the 6th interruption landed, it wasn't just Cruz cutting her off. It was arrogance cutting into dignity. It was a symbol of what happens when power mistakes itself for authority. The moment was no longer about procedure, it was about principle, and that is why the nation was watching so closely. Because this was not a spat. It was not another forgettable clash in the endless noise of politics. It was the crystallization of a truth that progressive voices have long understood. Interruptions are never neutral. They are attempts at control, at erasure, at dominance. And when the interrupter underestimates the resolve of the one being silenced, the effect can backfire in ways no strategy can contain. Cruz thought he was winning ground with each interjection. He thought every cut-in was another notch of authority. But what he failed to see was that each interruption was building tension, fueling anticipation, stacking the weight of his arrogance higher and higher until it was ready to collapse under its own pride. And yet, Cruz had no idea that his pattern of interruptions was walking him straight into a trap of his own making. To understand the weight of Ted Cruz's seventh interruption, you have to understand the man behind it. Cruz has spent his political career cultivating an image, sharp-tongued, quick-witted, relentless in his pursuit of what he calls truth. But beneath that branding lies a habit that has followed him for years, his tendency to overpower, to bulldoze, to drown out voices rather than engage with them. From the early days of his Senate career, Cruz discovered that volume and persistence could earn him headlines faster than nuance or cooperation. During high-profile hearings, he developed a rhythm. Ask a loaded question, cut off the answer, then use the interruption itself as proof of superiority. In political theater, it can look like dominance, but in reality, it often reveals a man unwilling to listen, and this pattern is not confined to men he disagrees with. Time and again, Cruz has been accused of talking over women, particularly women of color, in settings where the optics and the lived reality make his actions feel less like debate and more like dismissal. In one hearing after another, witnesses and colleagues alike have been forced to raise their voices simply to finish a sentence in the shadow of his interruptions. The senator seems to believe that being louder makes him more right, that arrogance has also followed him onto bigger stages. During his run for president, debates with his fellow Republicans showcased the same tactic: interject, redirect, and overwhelm. While some praised his aggressiveness, others recoiled at the smugness. Even members of his own party groaned at the grandstanding, calling him difficult to work with, too eager to hear himself speak, too quick to substitute performance for persuasion. And yet, Cruz often cloaks this behavior in lofty rhetoric. He claims to be a defender of democracy, a champion of free speech, a guardian of the Constitution. He talks about the sacredness of debate, about protecting America from authoritarian tendencies. But what is democracy if not the ability to be heard? What is free speech if it is constantly interrupted? And what is the Constitution's promise if voices are silenced by arrogance in the very halls meant to protect them? The contradiction is glaring. On the one hand, Cruz presents himself as the protector of open discourse. On the other, his actions repeatedly undermine the very foundation of that discourse: respect. His behavior says, "I will defend your right to speak until your words challenge me, until your identity threatens me, until your presence reminds me that power is shifting in ways I cannot control." And this is where the villainy takes shape. It's not simply about rudeness. It's about what those interruptions represent. They signal to the public that some voices matter more than others. They reinforce the very hierarchies progressives have long fought against. The hierarchies that silence women in boardrooms, that ignore immigrants at rallies, that dismiss working people at town halls. Cruz doesn't just interrupt. He embodies interruption. That is why his actions provoke such strong emotions. Viewers watching from home don't just see a senator cutting off a congresswoman. They see their own struggles reflected back at them. The boss who won't let them finish, the teacher who dismisses their question, the colleague who repeats their idea as if it were his own. Cruz, in his smugness, becomes a stand-in for every arrogant voice that has ever tried to shrink another into silence. And yet, despite the criticism, he revels in it. The interruptions continue, the smirks grow sharper, the dismissals more frequent. Cruz relishes the performance because he believes it makes him untouchable. He thrives on control, on the illusion that dominance equals victory. But dominance is fragile. Control can slip in an instant. In that committee room, Cruz was not simply interrupting Jasmine Crockett. He was reenacting years of arrogance, years of contradictions, years of choosing volume over respect. And as the interruptions stacked higher, he was setting the stage for the moment he never saw coming, because arrogance, when unchecked, breeds its own downfall. And Cruz, blinded by his own belief in control, was about to discover that the very tactics he used to silence others could become the reason his own voice lost its power. But while Cruz relished control, he was about to face someone who refused to play by his script. Before she sat in that committee room, before she faced down Ted Cruz's interruptions, Jasmine Crockett had already lived through battles that would have broken lesser spirits. Her story is not one of privilege or inherited power. It is one of persistence, grit, and an unwavering refusal to be silenced. To understand the force behind her calm, steady stare that day, you have to step back into the journey that brought her here. Jasmine Crockett did not rise from a background that guaranteed her a seat in Congress. She carved her own path. A daughter of hard-working parents, she grew up with the quiet but unshakable lesson that voices can only matter if they are used. From a young age, she was taught that dignity was not given freely. It had to be claimed and protected. That lesson shaped her not just as a student, but as a woman who refused to bow her head when life demanded submission. When she chose law as her calling, it wasn't for prestige. It was for justice. She became an attorney, stepping into courtrooms where the odds were stacked high against the people she defended. And there, under the fluorescent lights of local courthouses, she came face to face with the same arrogance she would later confront in Washington. Judges who doubted her, opposing counsels who dismissed her, systems designed to exhaust her clients into surrender. Yet every time Crockett stood her ground, every dismissal only sharpened her voice. Every attempt to diminish her only deepened her resolve. Her reputation grew, not as someone who shouted the loudest, but as someone who never wavered. She fought for those without resources, without status, without the kind of privilege that allows a person to walk into a room already respected. For her, law was not just practice. It was resistance. It was a way of declaring that no one, no matter how powerful, had the right to trample over another's dignity. And when she stepped into politics, those same values came with her. As a state legislator and later in Congress, Crockett made her mark by refusing to dilute her convictions. She spoke with the clarity of someone who had spent her career defending those who could not afford to be interrupted. Her speeches cut through noise not because they were rehearsed, but because they were lived. Behind every phrase was a story, a client, a community that had been told it was too small to matter. It was this authenticity that made her so dangerous to men like Cruz. He thrived on bluster, but she thrived on truth. He raised his voice to command attention, but she raised her voice to restore balance. To many watching across the country, Crockett became more than a politician. She became a reflection of their own fights. The immigrant worker demanding fair wages, the young student standing up against prejudice, the single parent challenging an unjust system. She carried them all into that chamber even when the man across from her tried to talk her down. And unlike Cruz, Crockett knew silence well. She had endured it as a lawyer when judges dismissed her arguments. She had endured it as a woman in politics when colleagues underestimated her. She had endured it as a black woman facing the intersecting weight of both racism and sexism. Silence was not new to her. It was familiar. But she had never let it win. That is why, as Cruz cut her off again and again, Crockett did not flinch. Each interruption reminded her of the obstacles she had faced her entire life. Each smug smirk was another echo of the people who told her she would not succeed. And each time he leaned forward, trying to shrink her voice, she drew upon years of practice in holding firm against forces determined to erase her presence. What Cruz thought was a tactic to dominate was to Crockett nothing more than déjà vu. She had seen this arrogance before. She had defeated it before. And every scar, every courtroom battle, every moment of underestimation had prepared her for this stage. She was not just responding to Cruz that day. She was responding to a lifetime of attempts to silence her and those she represented. It was resilience born not of comfort, but of struggle. It was a calm forged not in entitlement but in fire. And in that chamber, under the glare of cameras and the smirk of a senator, Jasmine Crockett carried herself with the dignity of someone who had survived storms far greater than one man's interruptions. She was not rattled. She was ready. And it was this very resilience that would soon turn the entire room upside down. The hearing began with a rhythm familiar to anyone who has watched Ted Cruz operate. He leaned in early, eager to seize the stage, ready to remind everyone that the microphone was his weapon of choice. Jasmine Crockett had barely completed her opening points before Cruz cut in with the first interruption. His voice carried that practiced tone of authority, half question, half declaration, meant to throw her off balance. But Crockett didn't bite. She paused, adjusted her papers, and let the silence speak louder than his intrusion. The first jab had landed, but she remained unshaken. The second interruption came just as she was laying out the facts. Cruz, visibly restless, raised his hand slightly but didn't wait for recognition. He launched into a counterpoint, designed not to challenge her logic but to derail her flow. Crockett's eyes narrowed just slightly, enough to signal that she had noticed the tactic, but not enough to give him the satisfaction of a reaction. Viewers at home leaned closer to their screens, already sensing that this was not going to be an ordinary exchange. By the third interruption, the smugness had begun to creep across Cruz's face. He smirked, cutting her mid-sentence with a rhetorical flourish, his tone dripping with condescension. The committee chair shifted uneasily, but the cameras were already locked in on the moment. Crockett's voice, when she finally reclaimed the floor, carried the same even tone. Controlled, precise, unwilling to rise to his bait. Her restraint was not weakness, it was strategy. The fourth interruption came sharper, more forceful. Cruz leaned forward, gesturing with his hand as though her words needed to be swatted away. The arrogance was palpable, and Crockett's irritation flickered across her face for the first time. Her lips pressed tight, her jaw firmed. Yet still she didn't unleash. Instead, she waited for the room to quiet, then continued as though his intrusion had been nothing more than a passing cough. That restraint only heightened the tension. The audience could feel it building like a bowstring pulled tighter with every exchange. The fifth interruption drew murmurs from the room. Cruz, emboldened, raised his voice above hers without hesitation. It wasn't an argument anymore. It was an attempt to dominate. Crockett leaned back slightly in her chair, her hands folded, letting him speak over her as if to say, "Go ahead. Finish. The floor will still be mine when you're done." The patience was surgical, and with every second she refused to be rattled, Cruz revealed more about his own insecurity than about her composure. And then came the sixth interruption. By now, staffers shifted in their seats, some visibly uncomfortable. Viewers online erupted with outrage, their feeds filling with messages like, "Let her speak," and "This is beyond disrespectful." Cruz, however, only grew more pleased with himself. He leaned back after the interruption, nodding smugly, certain that he had succeeded in reducing her voice to background noise. Crockett's eyes fixed forward, steady as stone. Irritation was there, yes, but beneath it was something more potent, readiness. 6 times. 6 attempts to cut her down, to dismiss her words, to make her presence feel small. And 6 times, Jasmine Crockett had refused to break. Each interruption had not weakened her, it had prepared her. Each smug interjection had not silenced her, it had sharpened the edge of her response. The room was now electric with anticipation. The arrogance of Cruz had built a wall so high that everyone watching knew it was only a matter of time before it collapsed. Crockett had bided her time, endured the interruptions, and held her fire. But no one could hold back forever, and then came the 7th interruption, the one that broke the room wide open. The 7th interruption began like the others, with a smirk. Ted Cruz leaned forward, eyebrows arched, his hand cutting the air like a gavel he thought he owned. He didn't wait for Crockett to finish her point. He never had. His voice boomed across the chamber, laced with the kind of condescension that assumes no rebuttal is strong enough to matter. "Congresswoman," he began, dragging the title as if it were an inconvenience, "you're ignoring the real issue here." It wasn't just an interruption. It was a dismissal wrapped in arrogance, a deliberate attempt to erase her authority in one swing. Cruz had interrupted her 6 times already, but this one carried an edge sharper than the rest. He believed this was his moment to cement dominance, to show the cameras that he, not she, controlled the rhythm of the hearing. The room froze. Even those accustomed to the theater of Washington felt the sting of this particular intrusion. A staffer's pen stopped mid-scribble. The chair of the committee opened his mouth, then shut it again, unwilling to escalate further. The silence that followed was heavy, charged, as if the very walls were waiting for Crockett's reply. And then she looked up, her eyes locked on Cruz, steady, unblinking, calm in a way that only someone who has been underestimated her entire life can muster. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't rush. Instead, she let the silence stretch, forcing Cruz to sit in the discomfort he had created. "Senator," she said evenly, her words deliberate, "with all due respect, you've interrupted me 6 times already. If you're afraid of what I have to say, just admit it. But don't pretend your disrespect is debate." The words landed like a thunderclap. Gasps echoed across the chamber. Cameras zoomed in, capturing the flash of fire in her eyes, the steel in her tone. For a man who thrived on dominance, the accusation cut deeper than any policy point. Cruz leaned back, his smirk faltering for the first time, caught off guard by the precision of her strike. But Crockett wasn't done. She leaned forward, her voice calm but rising with each sentence, slicing through the silence he had left behind. This chamber is supposed to be a place where voices are heard, not shouted down, not dismissed, not erased. You can interrupt me 7 times or 70, but the truth won't change, Senator. Your noise doesn't make you right. It only makes you loud. The audience felt it, a shift in the room's energy. Staffers who had been tense moments before now exhaled quietly, their eyes wide. Online, viewers clipped the moment in real time, flooding timelines with captions. "This is how you handle arrogance." Cruz tried to cut in again, but this time Crockett didn't yield an inch. She raised her hand, not rudely, but firmly, the universal sign of someone reclaiming her time. "No," she said, her voice firmer now, unflinching. "You will let me finish. Because unlike you, I came here to speak for people who don't have the luxury of talking over everyone else. I came here to make sure voices that are too often silenced are finally heard. And I won't let your interruptions erase them." The chamber erupted, not in noise, but in silence. A silence so complete that it rang louder than applause. Cruz's jaw tightened, his smirk erased, his hand frozen on the desk. He had relied on arrogance to carry him, but arrogance cannot survive dignity spoken with clarity. Crockett pressed on, every word a steady strike. "You say you defend democracy. You say you defend free speech. But democracy is not built on silencing. Free speech is not built on shouting down. You can claim the Constitution all you want, Senator, but what you're doing here isn't protecting it. It's insulting it." For once, Cruz had no interruption, no smirk, no clever retort. The man who had cut her off 6 times before now sat mute, his face betraying the sting of a truth too sharp to dodge, and then she delivered the line that sealed the moment, the one replayed across social media millions of times within hours. "Senator Cruz, if you think interruption is strength, then you've mistaken arrogance for leadership. But leadership is listening, and that is something you still haven't learned." The room held its breath. Cameras clicked furiously. Onlookers whispered, some smiling, others stunned. Cruz's reputation for smug dominance had cracked in real time, shattered not by louder words but by sharper truth. Crockett leaned back in her chair, calm once more, her point delivered not with shouting, but with the precision of someone who knew the weight of her words would carry far beyond that chamber. She had not just defended herself. She had defended the principle that every voice deserves its space, no matter who tries to drown it out. The moment was over in seconds, but its echoes were immediate. Staffers exchanged glances that said more than words. Commentators rushed to draft their hot takes, and viewers across the nation felt something rare in politics, the visceral satisfaction of seeing arrogance collapse under the weight of dignity. Ted Cruz had underestimated her. He thought interruptions would control the narrative. But his seventh attempt at silencing had given Jasmine Crockett the platform to deliver the kind of takedown that could not be interrupted, could not be dismissed, and could not be forgotten. But the fallout from that single exchange didn't stop at the committee table. The moment Crockett's words hit the air, the chamber was not the only place holding its breath. Beyond those walls, millions of screens flickered with the same clip, replayed again and again, each view spreading like sparks in dry grass. Within minutes, hashtags surged to the top of trending lists. Crockett clapback. Seventh, interruption. A leadership is listening. On Twitter, the responses rolled in like waves. One user wrote, "This is how you shut down arrogance, with calm, collected truth." Another posted, "I want this framed in every civics classroom." Side by side with the quotes were looping videos of Cruz's smirk melting away in real time, the kind of instant replay people couldn't resist. The internet had decided this wasn't just a committee hearing, it was a cultural moment, memes multiplied at dizzying speed. Some showed Cruz's face with captions like, "When you realize interrupting doesn't work anymore." Others paired Crockett's line, "Leadership is listening," with images of historical leaders who embodied that very principle. TikTok creators stitched the clip with their own reactions. Gasps, cheers, mock play-by-plays delivered as though it were the final seconds of a championship game. Each edit carried the same energy: pride, vindication, joy at watching dignity win in a space so often polluted by arrogance. Late-night hosts wasted no time. By the evening broadcasts, Crockett's words were already the punchline and the headline. One host quipped, "Ted Cruz has been silenced by something he's never encountered before, a woman who refused to play his game." The audience roared, not just with laughter, but with recognition. They had seen the same clip hours earlier, had shared it with friends, had felt the shock of the moment before anyone spun it into talking points. Commentators, too, weighed in with rare consensus. Progressive outlets hailed Crockett's composure as an example of grace under fire. Even some centrist voices admitted the exchange was a defining blow to Cruz's trademark smugness. Analysts pointed out how Crockett had done what few managed, flipped the script on a man whose brand was built on dominating conversations. But it wasn't just commentary, it was participation. People online didn't merely observe the moment. They amplified it, gave it legs, transformed it into a living, breathing wave of collective energy. Communities that often felt ignored found themselves quoting her words in solidarity. "Your noise doesn't make you right. It only makes you loud." Teachers shared it with students. Parents shared it at the dinner table. Activists printed it on signs overnight. The line had already leapt from one room into the bloodstream of the nation. For many, it felt like vindication of something deeper. Cruz's interruptions weren't new. Millions of people had lived versions of that same dismissal in workplaces, classrooms, or family gatherings. Watching Crockett shut it down with poise gave them not just satisfaction, but validation. It was as though she had spoken for everyone who had ever been silenced mid-sentence, brushed aside, or told their voice didn't matter. Meanwhile, Cruz's camp scrambled. His allies insisted he had been misrepresented, that it was simply spirited debate. But the damage was already done. Every attempt to downplay the moment was drowned out by the viral clip playing on repeat. In politics, perception often outweighs spin, and perception was now cemented. Ted Cruz had been humbled, live, and the nation had witnessed it together. By nightfall, Crockett's name was everywhere. Commentators hailed her not just as a sharp debater, but as a leader who modeled something rare in politics: the ability to disarm arrogance without losing composure. Her words were dissected like lyrics, her tone analyzed like strategy. Yet the consensus was simple. She had won because she refused to play by Cruz's rules. The laughter and memes kept rolling, each one giving people another way to process the catharsis of the moment. But beneath the humor, something deeper was stirring. It wasn't just about Cruz's smirk or Crockett's mic drop. It was about what the confrontation revealed, about respect, power, and the hunger for leaders who could embody dignity without bending under pressure. And yet, beyond the laughter and memes, a deeper truth resonated nationwide. In the quiet that followed Crockett's final words, something larger than a political exchange had unfolded. This was not merely about a senator's interruptions or a congresswoman's resilience. It was about the eternal contest between arrogance and dignity, noise and truth, disrespect and representation. Cruz came into the room certain that domination equaled strength, that drowning out a voice would silence it. But Crockett revealed a different truth. Strength is not in volume, but in conviction. Her composure reminded the nation of an essential principle, that courage in the face of disrespect carries more weight than the loudest insult. Every time Cruz cut her off, he embodied a pattern too many recognize, the dismissal of voices that challenge privilege, the minimization of perspectives that disrupt the status quo. But Crockett's refusal to fold was a message to every viewer who has been told to stay quiet or wait their turn. Her victory was not just personal, it was symbolic. The moral was unmistakable. Leadership is not measured by how many interruptions one can make, but by how steadfastly one can stand for truth, even when interrupted. Arrogance may dominate a moment, but dignity endures. Crockett proved that when dignity meets disrespect, dignity holds the power to outlast, outshine, and out-inspire. For immigrants, for women, for people of color, for anyone who has been overlooked. That moment was more than entertainment. It was recognition. It said, your story matters, your voice matters, and no amount of noise can erase your worth. Crockett didn't just answer Cruz. She answered generations of silencing, embodying resilience as an act of representation. The exchange became less about two politicians and more about a mirror for America. Do we value arrogance masked as confidence, or the quiet strength of listening and respect? Do we celebrate those who interrupt, or those who insist on being heard without losing their dignity? Crockett's stance made the choice clear. She reframed the confrontation as a parable of justice, that truth may be interrupted, but it cannot be erased. Even as memes circulated and hashtags trended, the enduring lesson was not about Cruz's stumble, but about the universal hunger for leaders who rise above insult and refuse to bend under pressure. Crockett reminded the nation that courage is not reactive, it is principled. And in a time when politics often reward spectacle, she showed that true power comes from restraint paired with clarity. Because in the end, this wasn't just about a senator and a congresswoman. It was about the voices of millions who refused to be interrupted. Ted Cruz may have thought the seventh interruption would cement his control. Instead, it cemented his undoing. The moment he tried once more to drown out Jasmine Crockett, he handed her the stage, and she filled it with a voice that refused to be minimized. That is why the title rings true. His seventh line shut him down, not because of what he said, but because of what she refused to surrender. Crockett's dignity in the face of layered disrespect is what makes this more than a clip, more than a headline. It's a reminder of what leadership should look like: composure, resilience, and truth spoken with clarity, even when the odds or the voices against you seem overwhelming. Moments like this matter because they ripple outward. They remind us that arrogance doesn't get the last word, that interruptions don't erase truths, and that every time someone stands firm in their voice, they're standing for countless others who've been silenced before. Jasmine Crockett didn't just defend herself. She defended the principle that every voice deserves respect. And now the story is in your hands. If you believe voices like Jasmine Crockett's should never be silenced, share this story. Let it echo louder than arrogance. Subscribe so you don't miss the next moment where truth pierces through the noise. Add your voice to this growing chorus, because dignity doesn't just survive interruption. It outlasts it. Because in the end, the real headline isn't that Ted Cruz interrupted 6 times. It's that on the 7th, Jasmine Crockett showed the nation how silence can be broken, not by shouting, but by standing unshaken. And that lesson is worth carrying far beyond one room, one hearing, or one senator. It belongs to all of us.